It wasn't the sound of gunfire that told them they were close. It was the air. On the morning of April 29, 1945, the men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were pushing through the Bavarian mist. They were seasoned veterans. They had fought across the beaches of Sicily, up the mountains of Italy, and through the hedgerows of France. They knew what war smelled like: cordite, mud, diesel, and sweat. But this was different. 5 miles out, a sweet, cloying stench began to drift over the convoy. The soldiers checked their boots. They checked the engines. They thought it was a chemical plant. They thought it was a supply depot on fire. They were wrong. They were 5 miles downwind of a place that didn't exist on their tourist maps, and as they moved closer, the gray sky seemed to press down on them. The banter stopped. The radio chatter died out. A primal instinct kicked in, the kind that tells a predator it has walked into a trap, or perhaps a tomb. They had no idea that in less than an hour, the disciplined, professional soldiers they had been for 2 years would vanish. In their place would stand judge, jury, and executioner. They reached the rail line first. The tracks led into a massive, sprawling complex, but the train itself hadn't made it inside. It sat there, frozen on the tracks. 39 cattle cars. The engine was cold. There was no movement, no guards, just silence. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, the battalion commander, signaled his men to check the cargo. He expected ammunition, maybe tank parts. A lieutenant climbed up the side of the first car, slid the heavy wooden door back, and immediately fell backward into the snow, screaming. His men rushed forward, weapons raised, expecting an ambush. They looked inside. It wasn't supplies. It was a solid wall of humanity. 2,000 people had been crammed into these cars. They had been evacuated from Buchenwald weeks earlier, shipped without food or water to Dachau. They were skeletons wrapped in rags. But it wasn't just that they were dead. It was how they died. The soldiers moved down the line, opening door after door. The scene got worse. The bodies were intertwined, limbs locked together in a final struggle for warmth. And then, the soldiers noticed the details that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bite marks, fresh, jagged bite marks on the arms and legs of the dead. The realization hit the Americans like a physical blow. The people inside these cars had been so desperate, so mad with hunger, that they had tried to eat the dead to stay alive. A hardened sergeant, a man who had seen friends blown apart by artillery, walked behind a tree and vomited. A 19-year-old private from Oklahoma sat down on the tracks and started weeping uncontrollably. But for most of the 45th Infantry, the tears didn't last long. The shock was rapidly hardening into something else, a cold, vibrating, murderous rage. The rules of engagement were designed for war against soldiers. This wasn't war. This was a crime scene. While the Americans were processing this nightmare at the tracks inside the camp, a surreal piece of theater was taking place. The camp commandant, Martin Weiss, had already fled. He knew what was coming. But he left behind a subordinate to handle the handover, SS Lieutenant Heinrich Wicker. Wicker was a study in Nazi delusion. He knew the Americans were at the gates. He knew the war was lost. But he believed genuinely that he was an officer and a gentleman. He believed that if he followed protocol, he would be treated with the respect due to his rank. He spent that morning polishing his boots. He put on his cleanest uniform. He gathered a small escort and a white flag. He marched out to the main gate to meet the Americans, expecting a salute. He expected to formally surrender the garrison and perhaps share a cigarette with his American counterpart. He walked out of the gate and came face to face with the men who had just seen the train. Wicker clicked his heels. "I surrender this camp to the United States Army," he said in English. The American officer opposite him didn't salute. He looked at Wicker's shiny boots. He looked at his well-fed face, his clean uniform. Then he looked over Wicker's shoulder at the piles of corpses rotting in the sun. The American didn't say a word. He stepped forward and spit directly into the German's face. Wicker froze. The script he had written in his head shattered. There would be no officers' club. There would be no gentleman's agreement. The Americans pushed past him, storming the gate. The surrender was rejected. The 45th swept into the camp. The air was thick with coal dust and the smell of death. To the right of the main entrance lay the Kommandantur, the headquarters. Near it was a coal yard, a walled-off section filled with debris. A group of about 50 SS guards had gathered there. These weren't the elite combat troops the 45th had fought in Italy. These were camp guards, the men who manned the towers, the men who ran the ovens. They saw the Americans coming and realized the white flag at the gate hadn't worked. They panicked. They threw down their weapons. They raised their hands. "Hitler kaputt!" they shouted. "Hitler kaputt!" It was the magic phrase. It was supposed to mean, "I give up, don't shoot." Watching them was Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead. Bushyhead was a Native American, a quiet, intense officer. He was shaking. He had just passed the crematorium. He had seen the ovens, the doors left open, charred remains still inside. He looked at the 50 men standing in the coal yard. They were healthy, they were arrogant, they were alive. And something inside Lieutenant Bushyhead snapped. He didn't order his men to detain them. He didn't call for handcuffs. He looked at a machine gunner, a soldier nicknamed Bird Eye, who was setting up a .30 caliber machine gun on a tripod. Bushyhead didn't shout. He just gestured with his Thompson submachine gun. "Line them up," he said. The Germans were confused. They were prodded against a brick wall. They started to realize this wasn't a head count. "9! 9!" one shouted. "Geneva Convention! Geneva Convention!" The irony was suffocating. Men who had presided over a factory of death were now begging for the rules of civilized warfare. Bushyhead looked at Bird Eye. He nodded. The .30 caliber machine gun has a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute. When Bird Eye squeezed the trigger, the sound was deafening. A solid wall of lead tore into the brick wall and the men standing in front of it. It lasted about 10 seconds. The screaming stopped. The shouting of "Hitler kaputt" was replaced by the heavy mechanical clanking of the gun's bolt. When the smoke cleared, the snow in the coal yard was black with dust and red with blood. 50 men lay in a heap. Some were still twitching. Suddenly, a voice roared over the noise. "Stop it! What the hell are you doing?" It was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks. He had heard the sustained fire and came running, sprinting across the compound. He saw his men firing into the pile of bodies. Sparks pulled his Colt 1911 pistol and fired it into the air to break the trance. He ran up to the machine gunner and kicked him off the tripod. "What is wrong with you?" Sparks screamed. The gunner looked up. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't angry. He was crying. Tears were streaming down his face, cutting through the grime. "Colonel," he sobbed, pointing at the ovens nearby. "They deserved it." Sparks looked at the carnage. He looked at his men. He realized he was losing them. The discipline of the U.S. Army was dissolving in the face of pure evil. But the coal yard was just one incident. All over the camp, the dam was breaking. At Guard Tower B, a group of SS men realized they were trapped. They tried to come down the ladder hands up. The Americans at the base of the tower didn't wait. They used them for target practice. Crack, crack, crack. Bodies tumbled off the ladder, splashing into the murky water of the moat that surrounded the camp. It didn't stop there. As the wounded Germans struggled in the freezing water, American GIs walked up to the edge of the bank. They looked down at the men struggling to stay afloat. They didn't offer a hand. They didn't offer a rope. They emptied their M1 Garand clips into the water. One soldier later wrote home about that moment. He said, "It wasn't war. It was an execution. And I didn't feel a thing. After what I saw in those boxcars, they weren't human to me anymore. They were just targets." Then the third wave of violence began. The Americans had opened the fences. The prisoners, 30,000 of them, were free. They were weak, starving, and sick. But adrenaline is a powerful drug. They spilled out of the barracks. They didn't want food, not yet. They wanted the men who had tortured them. They found a German guard hiding in one of the watchtowers. A mob of prisoners stormed the tower. They didn't have weapons. They had shovels. They had sticks. They had their bare hands. They dragged the guard down. A young American lieutenant watched the mob descending on the screaming German. He turned to his sergeant, a veteran with a cigarette dangling from his lip. "Sergeant, should we stop them?" the lieutenant asked. "Should we fire a warning shot?" The sergeant took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaled, and watched the dust kick up around the beating. "No," he said. "Let them finish." In another corner of the camp, prisoners found a capo, a prisoner who had collaborated with the Nazis for extra food. They dragged him to the latrines and held his head under the filth until he stopped moving. For 1 hour, the hierarchy of the world was inverted. The slaves were the masters, and the masters were dying. By evening, order was finally restored. The rage burned out, replaced by exhaustion. But you cannot kill dozens of prisoners of war without leaving a trace. A few days later, the brass arrived. An investigative team led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker showed up. They weren't there to liberate, they were there to prosecute. Whitaker was a by-the-book officer. He began interviewing the soldiers. He collected the evidence. And the evidence was damning. There were photographs, clear black and white photographs of American soldiers standing over piles of executed Germans. There were witnesses. Whitaker wrote up a report. Investigation of alleged mistreatment of German guards at Dachau. It was a thick file. It concluded that the men of the 45th Division, the heroes who had liberated the camp, had violated international law. It recommended court-martials for Lieutenant Bushyhead, for the machine gunner, and even for Colonel Sparks. The report moved up the chain of command. It was a legal grenade. No one wanted to touch it. Finally, it landed on the desk of the most feared man in the European theater, General George S. Patton. Patton was a disciplinarian. He fined soldiers for not shaving. He slapped soldiers for cowardice. If anyone was going to uphold the rules of war, it was him. Patton sat at his desk in Munich. He opened the Whitaker report. He read the accounts of the shooting. He looked at the photos of the dead SS guards in the snow. Then, he picked up the other set of photos. The photos of the death train. The photos of the children stacked like wood. The photos of the bite marks. He called the investigating officer into his room. Patton held up the thick file of charges. "What is this garbage?" he barked. "Sir," the officer replied, "it is evidence of war crimes committed by the 45th. Patton stood up. His face was red. "War crimes!" he shouted. "You walk into a place like that. You see 2,000 dead bodies on a train, and you expect my boys to follow the rule book? Hell no!" Patton reportedly threw the file across the room. "These men were overwrought," Patton said. "They had nervous trigger fingers. It happens in war." Then, General Patton did something that isn't in the official manuals. He took the report, the only copy that existed, and he either burned it in his wastebasket or ordered it buried in the deepest, most classified archive in the U.S. Army, never to be opened. "There will be no trial," he said. "The SS got what they deserved. Dismissed." General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, quietly agreed. To put American heroes on trial for killing monsters would destroy the morale of the entire Army. The investigation was quashed. The charges vanished. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, the man who gave the order at the coal yard, went home to Oklahoma. He became a quiet man. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a book. He died in 1977, taking the full story of that 10-second massacre to his grave. The soldiers of the 45th tried to return to normal lives. They became postmen, farmers, fathers. But they all carried the same secret. Today, Dachau is a memorial site. Hundreds of thousands of people visit every year. They walk through the barracks. They see the ovens. They pay respects to the 30,000 victims who died there. But if you walk to the back of the camp, near the old coal yard, there is nothing. No plaque, no marker. The 50 SS guards who died against that wall were shoveled into unmarked graves. History has judged them. They were the architects of hell, and on April 29, 1945, the devil finally came to collect. It leaves us with the hardest question of the war, a question of morality versus reality. We like to think we would follow the rules. We like to think we are civilized. But if you had been there, if you had smelled that air, seen that train, and looked into the arrogant eyes of the men responsible, would you have been a soldier, or would you have been an avenger? Some call it a war crime. The men of the 45th called it justice. What would you call it?